Well, welcome yet again to our series of lectures on the literatures of Europe's Middle Ages. This, number 7. Last time we talked about Dante Alighieri, we talked about his life, and we talked about a number of his works, which I would wager most people don't know very well. Now we turn to the work that everyone associates with Dante, the comedy. Dante called his work La Commedia, the comedy. It was later readers who tagged it divine, partly because of its excellence, and partly because of its subject matter. Now for Dante himself, you might say, why does he call this a comedy? It's not funny at all. No. For Dante, comedy was a work written in unadorned language that started in sorrow and ended in joy. Now, Dante was echoing, but actually slightly garbling, Aristotle's argument that tragedy was a work in elevated language that started happily and ended in sorrow. Dante organized his great work of more than 14,000 lines in the first place into 3 canticles: Inferno, hell; Purgatorio, purgatory; Paradiso, heaven. The comedy is made up of 100 cantos, 100 songs, if you will. There are 34, 33, and 33, respectively, in hell, purgatory, and heaven. They average some 140 lines each. The cantos themselves are organized in 3-line units, terzine. The poem is built up with a rhyme scheme, which we call terza rima. Line 1 end rhymes with line 3, line 2 with line 4, and so forth, carried right through the poem. Each canticle has itself a tripartite organization. Cantos 1 to 9 are always prefatory. The final cantos always signify the crowning lesson of the canticle, and the remaining cantos tell the story of that canticle. Now, it's very important to stress that this deft arrangement of comedy, canticle, canto, terzine, provided Dante with tremendous flexibility in structuring his narrative. He can slow down and pause. He can go at breakneck speed. He can skip around. He can jump over things. He can go back to things. It's a tremendously supple way of organizing the poem. Now, Dante's sources, apart from his prodigious imagination, and we must not leave that out of account as a powerful source here, are numerous, but they're fairly easily listed. Among classical poets, for example, Virgil, Statius, Lucan, and Ovid predominate, and they're the commonest literary sources. The Bible, however, it's important to say, is cited or alluded to more frequently than any other source. Ancient philosophers provide a good deal of raw material, let's say, for example, on the shape of the universe. And they provide some fundamental ideas, and they provide some basic vocabulary. Now, where the poem is concerned, and where we think of authorial point of view, voice, and all of that, let's bear in mind that Dante poet sends Dante protagonist on a pilgrimage throughout the physical and spiritual universe. So Dante is not only the poet here, he is also the chief character in the poem. Dante is accompanied, guided really, first by the Roman poet Virgil, then by Beatrice, whom we met in La Vita Nuova, and finally, at the very end, by St. Bernard. Why these characters appear we'll turn to in a few minutes. Dante's visit to hell, for example, is in part modeled on Book 6 of Virgil's Aeneid, where Aeneas traveled to the underworld to go and see his father. So classical allusions are almost everywhere, and classical structuring devices are almost everywhere. Midway through life's journey, the poet begins. Dante, presumably therefore, began the poem in 1300, he himself having been born in 1265. But he's alluding to Psalm 90. 70 is the sum of our years. Dante was wandering in a dark and terrifying forest when, somewhat improbably, he encounters the Roman poet Virgil. Virgil agrees to guide Dante out of the dark forest, but far beyond it as well. Worried that he's merely brash, Dante asks how he can be worthy. I am not Aeneas, I am not Paul, he says. Aeneas, the great journeyer of secular literature, Paul, the great journeyer of Christian literature. Virgil tells him that he will be, that he will become brave, perseverant, rational. We get a first hint here that the poet is going to destroy his former self. He's going to become something different at the end than he was at the beginning when he is wandering, terrified, in the dark wood. Dante and Virgil approach the mouth of hell, where they read the inscription, "Abandon hope, all you who enter here." For that, of course, is precisely what marks those who live in hell. They have no hope. The sinners in hell, those who died unrepentant, can never leave. But the rich irony, of course, is that Dante, though a sinner, and he fully acknowledges his sinfulness, can amend his ways and can escape from hell on this journey and not wind up there at the end of life's journey. Dante also comes for the very first time to see God as judge. Previously, we are given a sense of this in the opening of the comedy, but we have this sense powerfully in his earlier writings. He had seen God as a miracle worker and as creator. Now God is a judge. Hence, among many other powerful themes that inform the comedy as a whole, divine justice will be at the heart of Dante's project. Now, Dante and Virgil first encounter those eternally unnamed persons who refuse to take chances, to take stands during their lives. Very interesting. The point here is that it is as if they were never really alive. If you are sort of wimpy and cowardly and risk-averse, you have not lived. Better to be bold and venture much. They then encounter the righteous pagans. This is the realm where Virgil spends eternity. Normally, this is where Virgil is. These people are good and just in every way, but they do not know God. Very important point here. Dante has learned that God's justice is absolute. We're going to find this reiterated on a couple of later occasions. In Canto 5, the intrepid travelers enter hell, and they encounter two certainly of the most famous characters in the Divine Comedy, the star-crossed lovers Paolo and Francesca. These are, maybe, the most famous and most interesting characters that we encounter. Dante's protagonist is at first sorrowful, particularly at Francesca's fate. Virgil steadies him, says, no, keep your wits about you, boy. You must understand here. Francesca's sin seems so small on human terms. Now, Dante here has a little bit of fun with romance literature. What has happened? Paolo and Francesca, star-crossed married lovers, but not married to each other, are in love. And their love has been chaste. And then they read a French romance about Lancelot. And, spurred by the romance, Francesca steals a kiss. For this, she is condemned to hell eternally. Well, we might say that's a bit severe. But the point here that Dante is making is precisely that she, Francesca, subjected reason to passion and degraded the divine spark in her. We'll see as we go along why this was in fact so serious. Now, this hell in which Dante and Virgil are traveling is an imaginary pit that descends down into the earth in a series of concentric circles. Once Dante and Virgil enter hell proper, the circles represent various kinds of sins. Very interesting then to see how Dante organizes his moral universe. In general, we can say that the categories of sins are incontinence, violence, and deception. We can reformulate that a little bit and say that Dante creates a kind of a moral scale, or if you will, a moral spectrum. At one end of that spectrum, the less serious end, we encounter those who succumbed to human appetites. We all wish to do things that we know are wrong. At the other end of that spectrum, the more serious end, we encounter those who willed evil. Now, Dante's way of imagining sins is further intriguing. For instance, among the violent, we find tyrants and thugs and brigands. Well, that doesn't surprise us. But we find heretics, those violent against religion, blasphemers, those violent against God, sodomites, those violent against Christian morality, usurers, those violent, well, against the poor, against those who are the victims of their usury, against God's word, against the teachings of the church. These were, Dante insists, people who somehow aligned themselves with the created order. Instead of trying to overcome the created order, they aligned themselves with it. Their private consciences and public conduct were out of step. Here again is a theme that Dante will work out again and again and again and again. What goes on in your heart ought to govern what you do. Now, among deceivers, we find seducers, panderers, fair enough, corrupt popes. Dante gets his revenge on Boniface VIII, whom he liked not at all, by putting him in hell. Politicians, hypocrites, and thieves. These are people who have somehow undermined human dignity and harmed society. Their offense, in other words, has not merely been personal. They have not only sinned and in some sense jeopardized themselves, they have harmed others. Dante's hell as a whole is a place of ironic inversions. We go along reading where cunning punishments fit each kind of sin. We haven't time here to go through Dante's really cunning list of eternal punishments. Speakers condemn themselves as they explain their predicaments. And what we find here is that in almost every case, the speaker gives a perfectly accurate description of what he or she did without realizing why it was wrong. There, of course, is the point. They have never acknowledged their flaws and repented. Once the pilgrims have gotten to the bottom of hell and encountered Satan, the most treacherous of all the betrayers, and thus of all beings, they are ready to move to a new realm. Now, among the morally fastidious, let's bear in mind here that they meet Paolo and Francesca at the beginning of hell. Their sin is sexual. They meet Satan, the great betrayer, at the end. So Dante and Virgil leave the Inferno, and they go to Purgatorio. The mountain of Purgatory is Dante's most original literary creation by a long shot. Purgatory was a standard doctrine of the medieval church, but no one had visualized purgatory the way Dante did in the comedy. It's a conical mountain, the very opposite of the conical but concave hell. It is precisely opposite Jerusalem on the face of the earth. A bit like the hell, it has antipurgatory, the entry section, purgatory proper, and then Eden, or the earthly paradise, the last step before heaven. Now, within purgatory, there's a series of terraces or ledges. Each one of these ledges represents one of the deadly sins: pride, envy, wrath, sloth, avarice, gluttony, lust. We've had occasion to see, for example, in the Romance of the Rose, that having these great discussions of virtue and vice was a common medieval literary phenomenon. We saw that these trace back to the poet Prudentius in his Psychomachia. So here we find people arrayed according to which of the deadly sins they have committed an offense. Now, purgatory itself is a place of purgation. People who have hope, crucial here. In hell, they have no hope. In purgatory, the people have hope of one time seeing God. But they must first be purged. The burden of their offense, in some sense, must be lightened. Interestingly, too, those in purgatory are resubmitted, after death, are resubmitted to the regime of time. Hence, there's all sorts of temporal and astronomical references in the Purgatorio. But the idea is to pass through purgatory and eventually to reach the pristine state of Eden, the earthly paradise, before then moving on to heaven. Purgatory provides a model, and the word model or the word example, two words I want you to have very much in mind as you think about the comedy as a whole, and we'll draw them tightly together at the very end of our remarks here. But in any case, purgatory is a model of time well spent. Now, inhabitants of purgatory, for instance, are eager to see visitors. They're eager to have news of the world that they have left behind. They're particularly interested to hear that people are praying for them. One great theme, then, of the Purgatorio is reunion of souls with God, of family members with one another, of members of states and societies. Poetry and the arts rise again. In hell, they were dead, or they were instruments of evil and corruption. Now, again, they are instruments of regeneration. Those in the anti-purgatory, sort of the vestibule of purgatory, if you will, are the dilatory and negligent. Now, you may compare them with those cowards of the antechamber of hell. Those on the terraces sinned mightily in some respect, and their situation reminds us of hell, but we know that these sinners will pass on to heaven. For instance, envy is a sin of the eyes. How so, you ask? Well, because to envy is to fail to see the excellence in others. The envious, therefore, sit indistinguishable from the landscape, and their eyes are sewn shut, so that like a falcon in training, that's not my image, it's Dante's, they must learn to rely upon God alone. What a fitting punishment for one who failed to see the excellence in others. That person now becomes virtually invisible. In Canto 28, Dante prepares to enter Eden. Virgil tells him that he is now free, upright, and whole. Dante learns that freedom is not license, but the ability to do God's will. This notion of freedom is not much to the taste of the modern world. We tend to think of freedom as an absence of restraint. For Dante, freedom was an absence of impediments to doing what is right. Freedom was, in other words, a profound obligation. Dante also learns that Virgil has served his purpose and must now return to limbo. Beatrice takes over as his guide. The transition from Virgil to Beatrice signifies the move from time to eternity, from the natural to the supernatural. But Dante spends some time, about 5 cantos, in Eden, in the earthly paradise, learning that this is the true Parnassus, the longed-for place of the ancients. And from the earthly paradise, one passes on to the Paradiso, to heaven. Paradise is organized on sort of Aristotelian Ptolemaic terms. We have 7 planetary spheres, the realm of the fixed stars, the primum mobile, and the empyrean. So Dante has borrowed his kind of vision of how he sketches out heaven from ancient writers. Places and distances are less fully articulated in heaven than in hell or purgatory. This is not surprising. Place and time and distance, these are human, these are temporal, these are worldly concepts. Dante certainly knew the long discussion, for instance, in Augustine's Confessions, about whether there is time in heaven. The answer is no, you see. Time is a human notion. Heaven is full of paradoxes. Flesh and spirit, played out again and again and again. Well, this is something that Dante could have taken from any number of places in the Hebrew Scriptures. This is something that Dante can have taken from St. Paul. This is something that Dante can have taken from the Church Fathers. Fair enough. The gradually dawning understanding of the incomprehensible. This is one of the wonderful notions one encounters in paradise. Slowly but surely, I understand that which cannot be understood. There is a wonderful sort of sight game played here. Vision, looking with the mind's eye, understanding as things really are, grows greater and greater and greater as sight, human sight, physical sight, the eyes of the body, grow dimmer and dimmer and dimmer. People are less distinct in the paradise than in hell or purgatory. And after the first planetary spheres, they're virtually invisible. In the first planetary spheres, those associated with the moon, Mercury, and Venus, we find souls, interestingly enough, who are still shadowed by the earth. They were once guilty of inconstancy of will, of vainglory, and of lust. So now they are still in some way shadowed. Throughout heaven, Dante encounters the souls of saints, whom he praises, so as to stress their value as example. I come back yet again to the theme of model or example. They are models and examples for Dante and for everyone. So one could, for example, compare Piccardo Donati with Francesca. The latter willed passion. The former said, "In his will is our peace." On the threshold of the Empyrean, Dante takes leave momentarily of Beatrice. He will see her again, indistinctly, at the very end. And he tenderly addresses her as she departs with the familiar tu form. In the Romance languages, as you know, there is an informal and a formal way of addressing people. And in all of his earlier writing, he had addressed Beatrice formally. Now, as he takes leave, finally having understood, he says, tu. And he thanks her for her role in saving him, echoing here, La Vita Nuova. St. Bernard now takes over as Dante's final guide. Owing to his love for the Virgin, and owing to his theology of the mystical union. St. Bernard, a 12th century theologian, a monk, a Cistercian monk. Dante gains then a blinding flash of insight into the majesty and the mystery of God. The promise that Virgil had made to him in the dark wood had been fulfilled. The poem has come full circle. Now, interpretive possibilities are almost endless with the comedy. We may suggest really just a few. At the end, for instance, Dante saw three great radiances. Well, the Trinity, of course. And one of them had a human face. Christ, the second person of that Trinity. Here is one of the greatest, the profoundest themes of the comedy. How to understand the mystery of the Incarnation. How to understand the divine present in the human. Very closely related to this, and running throughout the comedy, is a long series of meditations or reflections on the relation of creator and creation, of God to man, and therefore, again, of the divine in the human, the divine and the human. Again and again and again, Dante reflects on these subjects. We might ask, what is a pagan poet doing guiding Dante to heaven? Well, a literary homage, sure, but there's more to it than that. Virgil had acquired a reputation, even in Christian antiquity, even among the church fathers, of being a Christian before Christ. His fourth eclogue, a poem that hopefully pointed towards the birth of a son and therefore heir to Augustus Caesar, was often reinterpreted as foretelling the birth of Christ. Virgil himself had longed for peace, for harmony, for unity. In some way, his great Aeneid was a poem about the way things used to be, not about the world of civil war and strife through which he himself and his Romans had lived. Virgil had, or was believed to have held, a selfless devotion to moral ideals. He had very refined moral values. He also wrote an exemplary book. In some ways, Aeneas and all the other characters we encounter in the Aeneid are type figures. Virgil had also a profound sense of the transitoriness of this world, how all changes so abruptly, so unpredictably. He was a herald of the Roman Empire, which was for Dante essential for his own times and for history. We saw that in discussing Dante's De Monarchia. Virgil loved Italy, the land and its peoples, as did Dante. Dante, like Virgil, was not Roman-born, but was devoted to the idea of Rome. So it's not so surprising, perhaps, that Virgil might have been the first guide. Now, the comedy is about the making of a prophet, about Dante's claims to be a prophet, and about a prophet speaking in Italian. We've seen that these were themes that Dante had worked out for himself in the Convivio and in De Vulgari Eloquentia. Now, it's true that if he is claiming prophet and prophecy, he protests that he is neither Aeneas nor Paul. But he learns, slowly, that heaven has a purpose for him. Virgil tells him first, then Beatrice, and then, in Paradiso 15 and 16, his ancestor Cacciaguida. Dante learns to speak as if he were in some sense God's scribe. It is almost as if he were writing scriptures, and his work was to be interpreted as scripture. The comedy is about truth, about what is finally really true. God wishes people to know his truths, Dante insists, and God provides opportunities to understand those truths by observing the known universe. The world around us has much to teach us. So for Dante, for example, physical discoveries tend to confirm theological ones. God's truths can be expressed in the language of science and in the language of scholasticism. Philosophy is not what one reads or knows. Now, Dante read a great deal. Dante knew a lot. Dante communicated a great deal of his reading and knowing through the comedy. But in the end, philosophy is nothing if it is not practical. It is what you do. It is how you live, not what occupies your head. The comedy is about spiritual and social and political reform. Dante longs for a better world, a different one than the one in which he lives. There's no question about that. He believes that he is writing for the common good. He is not producing merely a work of art that is to be somehow admired aesthetically, though one cannot believe that Dante lavished such great attention on a work that he didn't want to be received that way. But it's more than that. Here again are his beautiful lies. Here again is that kind of verismo that we saw in Parabat, or whoever it was who wrote El Cid. Everything here is exemplary. Everything here tells a moral tale. Finally, the comedy is about love. Dante permits himself, in some ways, to return to the sweet new style of his youth. He permits himself to understand Beatrice in a new way, or to give a new articulation to the Beatrice of La Vita Nuova. But above all, the comedy is about God's love and its profound mysteries. The Paradiso begins with the glory of him who moves all things. And it ends, and we shall end, with these words. Yet, as I wished, the truth I wished for came, cleaving my mind in a great flash of light. Here my powers rest from their high fantasy, but already I could feel my being turned, instinct and intellect balanced equally, as in a wheel whose motion nothing jars, by the love that moves the sun and other stars.